The words we never hear in time often become the ones we carry forever. That thought had never meant anything to me until the afternoon I unlocked the front door of the house I had spent my whole childhood trying to leave behind. My name is Michael Anderson. I was 42 years old, successful by every measure my coworkers admired, yet strangely empty in the quiet moments no one else could see. My mother had passed away years earlier, and after the funeral I convinced myself that the fastest way to move forward was to stay busy. I accepted projects across the country, answered fewer calls from family, and told myself that memories belonged in photographs instead of everyday life. Now I stood in the same hallway where she had once measured my height with a pencil every birthday. The marks still climbed the wall, each one carrying a date written in her careful handwriting. I reached out to touch them before quickly pulling my hand away, as though the paint itself might remember something I had forgotten. I had returned for one simple reason. The house had finally been listed for sale. My plan was practical. Sort through the remaining boxes, sign the paperwork, hand over the keys, and leave before sunset. I believed that was all this visit would become. The living room smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Dust floated through thin beams of afternoon sunlight as if time itself had slowed inside those familiar walls. Every object seemed frozen exactly where my mother had left it. Her favorite rocking chair still faced the window. A faded quilt rested neatly across its back. A tiny ceramic bird sat on the shelf beside family photographs that had not been touched in years. I carried box after box toward the front porch until only the attic remained. Climbing those narrow wooden stairs felt like stepping backward through my own life. The attic had always been my mother's favorite place to store things she believed might matter someday. Holiday decorations. Handmade quilts. School drawings she refused to throw away. I smiled despite myself when I found a small baseball glove I had not seen since middle school. Then, behind an old cedar chest covered by a white sheet, I noticed a small wooden box unlike anything else in the room. It had been carefully polished, even after all these years. Across the lid, carved with unmistakable precision, were two simple words. Michael. My heartbeat slowed. I lifted the box carefully and brushed away the thin layer of dust. A folded note rested beneath the brass latch. In my mother's handwriting were the words, "Open this only when you finally understand what family truly means." I stared at the sentence for what felt like forever, realizing with growing unease that perhaps this was never a box my mother had expected me to find quickly. Perhaps she had always known it would take me years before I was ready to open what she had left behind. My fingers hesitated above the brass latch for several long seconds before I finally lifted it. The small wooden box opened without a sound, releasing the faint scent of cedar that instantly reminded me of my mother's linen closet. Inside rested a single cream-colored envelope, carefully sealed and addressed in the same elegant handwriting I had seen on birthday cards every year of my childhood. For Michael. Nothing more. No date. No explanation. I slowly broke the seal, suddenly aware that I was holding words my mother had written knowing she would never have the chance to speak them herself. The letter began simply. My dear Michael, if you are reading this, it means life has finally slowed you down long enough to come home. I stopped reading. My throat tightened as I looked around the attic, half expecting to hear her footsteps climbing the stairs with another box of holiday decorations balanced in her arms. Instead there was only silence. I continued. She did not write about illness or sadness. She did not mention regrets. Instead she thanked me for being the curious little boy who once filled the backyard with impossible questions about birds, clouds, and stars. She remembered teaching me how to ride a bicycle, laughing when I insisted I no longer needed her hand even though I kept looking over my shoulder to make sure she was still there. Every paragraph uncovered a memory I had forgotten, and every memory carried a warmth that felt almost impossible after so many years. Then I reached a sentence that completely changed the way I remembered our final years together. I know you have spent a long time believing that I was disappointed when you moved away. I never was. I only worried that you believed success required leaving love behind. I lowered the letter and closed my eyes. For years I had convinced myself that every difficult conversation we shared before I accepted my first job across the country had been proof that she wanted me to stay close to home. I remembered our arguments, my frustration, and the guilt that followed every holiday I missed because work seemed more important. Yet nowhere in her words was there anger. There was only understanding. She wrote that parents often struggle to say goodbye with smiles even when their hearts are full of pride. She admitted she sometimes sounded afraid because she loved me deeply, not because she wanted to hold me back. The realization settled over me like quiet rain after a long drought. How many years had I carried a misunderstanding that existed only inside my own mind? I turned another page and noticed a smaller folded note tucked between the sheets. Across the front my mother had written, "Please do not stop here. The hardest truth is still waiting, and I hope you will forgive both of us before you reach the final page." I stared at those words as my heartbeat quickened once again, realizing the letter had only just begun to reveal the life my mother had quietly lived behind the memories I thought I already knew. The final sentence on the folded note echoed through the silent attic long after I lowered it back into the box. "Please do not stop here." My mother had always known how to make simple words feel impossibly important. I unfolded the remaining pages with greater care, almost afraid that reading too quickly might somehow shorten the last conversation I would ever have with her. The next page did not begin with another memory. Instead, it began with an apology. "There is something I chose not to tell you because I believed the right time would eventually come. When that time never arrived, I decided to leave it here instead." I felt my heartbeat quicken. Throughout my life I had imagined countless conversations we never had, but I had never considered that my mother might also have carried things she struggled to say. She explained that during my final year of college, the company where she had worked for more than 20 years suddenly closed its local office. Losing her job had frightened her far more than she ever admitted. At the very same time I was preparing to graduate, dreaming about the engineering career I had worked so hard to earn. She wrote that every tuition payment I received during those final semesters had arrived exactly when I needed it, and I had assumed she had carefully planned for everything. The truth was very different. She confessed that she had quietly sold several treasured family heirlooms, including my grandmother's antique piano and my grandfather's collection of handcrafted fishing reels, so I would never have to interrupt my education. Tears blurred the ink as I reached the next paragraph. "You once apologized because you thought you were becoming a burden. I smiled and told you everything was fine because that was the only answer a mother could ever give." I slowly looked around the attic. The empty corner where my grandmother's piano had once stood suddenly made painful sense. As a young man I had barely noticed it was gone. I had been too busy chasing deadlines, promotions, and opportunities to ask why familiar pieces of home kept quietly disappearing. Another memory surfaced without warning. During my first year working in Chicago, my mother had canceled a planned visit, explaining that the old car needed unexpected repairs. I remembered feeling disappointed but never questioning the explanation. Now the letter revealed that she had canceled because she could not afford both the trip and my final student loan payment due that same month. She chose my future without allowing me to see the sacrifice. I covered my face with one hand, overwhelmed not by guilt alone but by the realization that love often hides itself inside ordinary decisions no one else ever notices. Near the bottom of the page she wrote one final thought before directing me to continue. "If you are tempted to regret the years we lost, please spend that energy loving the family who still stands beside you today. Regret cannot change yesterday, but love can still change tomorrow." I stared at those words until the attic faded around me. For the first time since returning home, I understood that the greatest inheritance my mother had left behind was never this house or anything stored inside it. It was the chance to become the kind of son, husband, and future father she had quietly believed I could still become. Leaving the attic, I carried the letter downstairs as though it were the most fragile object I had ever held. The late afternoon sun stretched across the hardwood floor, illuminating tiny scratches that I suddenly recognized from childhood games, holiday mornings, and ordinary afternoons I had once believed were too ordinary to remember. I settled into my mother's old rocking chair by the living room window, the same chair where she had spent countless evenings reading while waiting for me to come home. The house was silent except for the gentle creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet. I unfolded the next page, uncertain whether I was ready for whatever truth still waited there. My mother's handwriting remained steady, graceful, and unmistakably familiar. She wrote that love was rarely measured by the words people remembered saying. More often, it revealed itself through quiet choices that no one noticed at the time. She reminded me of the winter mornings when she woke before sunrise to scrape ice from my car so I could leave for high school a few minutes earlier. She remembered packing extra sandwiches because she knew one of my friends often came to school without lunch. She confessed that every birthday card she had ever given me included $20, not because it was all she could afford, but because she wanted me to know that even a small gift could carry great love when it came from the heart. As I continued reading, another memory surfaced with startling clarity. During my first year after college, I had missed Thanksgiving because an important project at work demanded my attention. My mother had smiled over the phone and told me she completely understood. I believed her. Now the letter gently revealed that she had cooked my favorite pumpkin pie anyway and left my place at the dining table untouched until the meal was over. Not to make anyone feel guilty, but because hope sometimes looks like believing someone might still walk through the front door. Tears quietly filled my eyes as I realized how many moments I had misunderstood. I had mistaken her calm acceptance for emotional distance when, in truth, it had been one of the deepest expressions of unconditional love. Near the bottom of the page she shared something I had never heard before. Your father once told me that children eventually stop listening to advice, but they never stop remembering how home made them feel. I slowly looked around the room. The warm colors, the old bookshelf, the family photographs, and even the faint scent of cinnamon that seemed forever woven into the walls suddenly became part of a lesson I had overlooked for years. My mother had never tried to build a perfect house. She had spent her life building a place where love always waited, even when I was too busy to notice. The final paragraph on the page carried one gentle request. She asked me not to measure my life by promotions, awards, or achievements alone. Instead, she hoped I would someday become the person my own family could always count on when life became difficult. As I folded the page onto my lap, I glanced toward the framed photograph of my wife and children resting on the mantel. For the first time in many years, I wondered whether I had been chasing success so relentlessly that I had overlooked the very people waiting for me to come home. The photograph on the mantel seemed different now. My wife, Emily, stood between our two children, all of them smiling into the camera during a summer vacation I had almost forgotten because I had spent much of that trip answering work emails. I picked up the frame and noticed a thin layer of dust along its edges. It struck me that I had been polishing my professional reputation for years while allowing the most important parts of my life to quietly gather dust. My mother's words lingered in my thoughts as I unfolded the final pages of her letter. The handwriting remained steady, but the message became even more personal. She wrote that every parent hopes their children will accomplish great things, yet no achievement could ever replace a shared dinner, an unexpected phone call, or an ordinary afternoon spent together. She admitted that there had been evenings when she sat on the front porch listening from my car, even after she knew I would not be coming home that weekend. She never blamed me for choosing my career. Instead, she prayed that one day I would discover there was enough room in a full life for both meaningful work and meaningful relationships. I could no longer hold back the tears. They fell silently onto the pages as I remembered birthdays I had celebrated through video calls, anniversaries I had shortened because of meetings, and family gatherings I had postponed with promises of visiting next month. There was always another deadline. Another promotion. Another project. Somehow I had believed that the people who loved me would always understand and always wait. My mother gently challenged that belief in the final paragraphs. She wrote that love is patient, but time is not. Every season that passes becomes part of someone's memory, and once it has gone, no amount of success can bring it back. Then she shared the one request she hoped I would honor. She asked me not to spend my life mourning everything we had missed together. Instead, she wanted me to create new memories with the family still walking beside me. She encouraged me to become fully present at the dinner table, to listen without distraction, to celebrate ordinary moments, and to tell the people I loved exactly how much they meant before another year quietly slipped away. Folded inside the last page was a small photograph of the two of us standing in the backyard on the day I graduated from college. I remembered the excitement of that afternoon, but I had forgotten the expression on my mother's face. Looking closely, I saw not pride alone but deep contentment, the quiet joy of someone who expected nothing in return except the chance to watch the people she loved flourish. I held the photograph against my chest for several moments before carefully placing every page back into the envelope. Outside the living room window, the evening sun settled behind the old maple tree my father had planted decades earlier. Its branches had continued growing through every season, even when no one was watching. Sitting alone in that peaceful room, I realized that my mother's greatest gift was not the letter itself. It was the opportunity to choose a different future while there was still time to become the husband, father, brother, and son she had always believed I could be. The next morning I canceled the return flight I had planned weeks earlier. It was the first time in years that I had rearranged my schedule for something other than work, and as I pressed the confirmation button on my phone, I felt an unfamiliar sense of relief rather than anxiety. There were still boxes to sort through inside the old house, but I no longer viewed the task as clearing away the past. Instead, I began to see it as understanding the life my mother had quietly built one thoughtful day at a time. Every drawer seemed to contain another reminder of her generosity. I found birthday cards she had carefully saved from neighbors, handwritten recipes with little notes in the margins, and newspaper clippings celebrating the achievements of former students she had encouraged during her years at the local elementary school. She had celebrated other people's successes with the same enthusiasm she had always shown for mine. That afternoon I discovered a small address book tucked inside a kitchen cabinet. Beside nearly every name, my mother had written short reminders such as, "Call on Tuesday," "Check after surgery," or "Bring soup when the weather turns cold." Reading those simple notes, I realized kindness had never been something she performed only during special occasions. It had been woven into the ordinary rhythm of her everyday life. Without thinking, I picked up my phone and called my younger sister, Sarah. We had spoken only a handful of times during the past 2 years, usually rushing through polite conversations before returning to our busy schedules. When she answered, there was a brief silence, followed by genuine surprise. We talked for nearly an hour. Instead of discussing paperwork or the future of the house, we shared memories. She laughed while reminding me how our mother insisted every Christmas cookie had to be shaped by hand because imperfect cookies always tasted more like home. I admitted that I had forgotten that tradition completely. Before ending the call, Sarah quietly thanked me for staying at the house a little longer. She confessed that she had worried I would sell everything before either of us had truly said goodbye. After hanging up, I walked into the backyard where the old maple tree still cast its familiar afternoon shadow across the grass. I remembered climbing its branches as a boy while my mother watched from the porch with a book resting in her lap. At the time, I believed she was reading. Now I understood she had probably spent far more time watching me than the pages in front of her. That evening I called Emily. Instead of rushing through the conversation, I listened as she told me about the children's school projects, a neighborhood barbecue I had forgotten was planned for the following weekend, and the little moments I usually missed because my attention remained divided. Before we ended the call, I told her something I had not said nearly often enough. I thanked her for carrying so much of our family's daily life while I chased one deadline after another. There was a quiet pause before she softly replied that she had been waiting a long time to hear those words. As darkness settled outside the windows of my childhood home, I looked once more at my mother's letter resting on the dining table. Its pages had not simply reminded me who she had been. They had begun changing the way I wanted to live the rest of my own life. Several days later I returned home carrying only a small suitcase, my mother's letter, and a quiet determination that felt far heavier than either of them. Emily met me at the front door with a warm embrace, and for the first time in years I did not glance over her shoulder toward my ringing phone or think about the unread messages waiting in my inbox. Instead, I simply stood there, grateful for the familiar comfort of home. That evening we gathered around the dining table with our children, Ethan and Lily. Normally dinner passed quickly before everyone disappeared into separate routines, but I asked if we could leave our phones in another room. The children looked surprised, and Emily smiled as though she had hoped to hear those words for a very long time. We lingered over homemade soup, talking about school projects, neighborhood friends, and funny moments that would once have slipped past me unnoticed. I found myself laughing more than I had in months. After dinner I opened an old family photo album that had been sitting untouched on a bookshelf. The children crowded beside me as I showed them pictures of their grandmother planting flowers, baking pies, and cheering at Little League games. They listened carefully as I shared stories they had never heard before, and with every memory I spoke aloud, I realized my mother's kindness was continuing to shape another generation. The following weekend I invited my sister Sarah and her family to visit. We spent the afternoon sorting through the keepsakes from our childhood, deciding together which treasures should remain in the old house and which should travel with each branch of the family. There were moments of laughter when we discovered handwritten recipes stained with flour and birthday cards filled with our childish drawings. There were quiet moments too, but they no longer felt heavy. Instead, they carried gratitude. Before everyone left, I surprised them with an idea that had been growing in my heart since I finished reading the letter. Rather than selling our mother's house immediately, I suggested we preserve it as a place where every generation of our family could gather at least once each year. Not because the building itself was extraordinary, but because it reminded us of the ordinary love that had quietly held our family together for decades. Sarah looked around the familiar living room before nodding with tears in her eyes. She admitted she had secretly wished for exactly the same thing but had been afraid to ask. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I walked through each room one more time. The house no longer felt like a collection of memories that belonged only to the past. It felt like the beginning of something new. My mother's final gift had not been a lesson about loss. It had been an invitation to protect the relationships that were still alive, to choose presence over distraction, and to remember that the strongest families are built one ordinary day, one thoughtful conversation, and one small act of love at a time. As I carefully returned her letter to its envelope, I realized that its words had already begun accomplishing exactly what she had hoped they would do. Spring arrived almost unnoticed, bringing fresh green leaves to the maple tree outside my mother's house and a sense that our family had quietly entered a new season as well. True to the promise Sarah and I had made, we planned our first annual family gathering there. It was not intended to be a grand celebration. We simply wanted the house to feel alive again, filled with conversation instead of silence. Emily prepared my mother's favorite apple pie using the handwritten recipe we had discovered among the kitchen drawers, while the children carefully set the dining table with plates that had not been used in years. Every small task felt meaningful because it carried a memory. Before lunch, Ethan asked whether he could see the letter that had changed everything. I hesitated for a moment before carefully unfolding the pages. Rather than reading every private word, I shared the passages my mother had clearly written as lessons meant to be passed forward. I told them how she believed that success should never replace family, how ordinary moments often become life's greatest treasures, and how love is expressed most clearly through consistent kindness rather than dramatic gestures. The room grew wonderfully quiet. Even the younger children listened with surprising attention. Sarah added her own memories, describing the countless evenings our mother volunteered to help neighbors without expecting recognition. Emily smiled as she admitted that many of those same habits had quietly influenced the way we were beginning to live our own lives. After lunch, we walked into the backyard, where the old maple tree cast its familiar shade across the lawn. The children laughed as they played the same games Sarah and I had invented decades earlier. Watching them run across the grass, I suddenly understood what my mother had hoped I would discover. A family's greatest inheritance is not stored inside a bank account or locked inside a safe. It is carried through traditions, conversations, forgiveness, and the decision to remain present for one another even during ordinary days. Before everyone left that evening, I brought out a simple wooden memory box and placed it on the dining table. I invited each family member to write one short letter every year about something they were grateful for, a lesson they had learned, or a hope they wished to pass to the next generation. We folded the letters, dated them, and placed them inside together. The children smiled at the idea of opening them many years from now, while Sarah quietly wiped away tears that needed no explanation. As I closed the lid of the box, I realized my mother's letter was no longer the final chapter of her story. It had become the first page of a new tradition that would continue long after all of us were gone. Standing in the doorway as my family waved goodbye beneath the golden evening sky, I felt a peace I had searched for in promotions, accomplishments, and distant cities but had never managed to find. Somehow it had been waiting here all along, inside the simple wisdom my mother had left behind and inside the people who still called this place home. 5 years passed more quickly than I ever imagined. Every spring our family returned to the old house beneath the maple tree, carrying homemade dishes, new photographs, and another collection of handwritten letters for the memory box. What began as a quiet promise between my sister and me slowly became a tradition our children eagerly anticipated. They no longer asked whether we had to spend a weekend there. Instead, they asked how many days remained until everyone would be together again. Watching them laugh across the backyard, I often found myself thinking about my mother. She would have smiled at the sound of their voices filling every corner of the house she had loved so dearly. One evening, after everyone had gone home, I remained on the front porch as the last light faded across the neighborhood. I carried my mother's letter with me, its edges softened from years of careful reading. I no longer opened it because I needed answers. I opened it because it reminded me of the person I wanted to become every single day. I realized that healing had not happened all at once on the afternoon I found the wooden box. It had arrived quietly through countless ordinary choices. Calling my sister more often. Leaving work early to attend my daughter's school concert. Teaching my son how to build a birdhouse in the garage instead of checking another email. Sitting beside Emily after dinner with no television, no phone, and no distractions. Those simple moments had slowly transformed our family in ways I could never have predicted. Before leaving the porch, I took a blank sheet of paper from my notebook and began writing my own letter. It was addressed to Ethan and Lily, not because I expected them to read it soon, but because I wanted them to have something honest waiting for them whenever life became complicated. I told them that success would bring satisfaction, but kindness would bring peace. I reminded them that no career, achievement, or possession could ever replace the comfort of a family that knew how to forgive, listen, and remain present. Most importantly, I wrote that love should never be postponed until tomorrow because tomorrow is never guaranteed. When I finished, I folded the pages carefully and placed them inside the same wooden box that had once waited patiently for me in the attic. As I closed the lid, I understood that my mother's greatest gift had never been the letter itself. It was the life her words inspired afterward. She had quietly changed the future of a family she would never again sit beside, simply by leaving behind truth, compassion, and hope. I stood, looked once more at the warm light glowing through the familiar windows, and smiled. My mother had left this world years ago, yet her voice still echoed through every thoughtful decision we made. Every meal we shared, every tradition we protected, and every embrace that lasted a little longer. In the end, I discovered that love does not disappear when someone is gone. When it is freely given, patiently remembered, and faithfully passed from one generation to the next, it becomes the one inheritance that time can never take away.